Since self-esteem is so important, not just to William James or to Becker or to your work, I mean, you quoted him in that first book as saying that self-esteem is the dominant motive of the human animal, in addition to making or believing that life has meaning. I don't think we should just leave it as tacitly understood. I think we should really flesh out what it is. So we all, I guess, have an idea of what self-esteem means, but what does it really consist in when we're getting down to brass tacks and trying to be specific and rigorous?
Yeah, again, really fine question. And the Becker's approach, and this is the one that we have adopted, is to, in his technical definition, it is the perception that one is a person of value in a world of meaning. And the way that Becker breaks that notion down in The Birth and Death of Meaning, he says, okay, let's do meaning first. And he's like, hey, I'm an anthropologist. Every culture has an account of the origin of the universe. Every culture has a prescription for how we ought to behave while we're here. And every culture offers a promise of immortality, be it literal or symbolic. And so Becker starts just with the declaration that the apprehending that life has meaning is just the bedrock of psychological equanimity. And he makes that argument both on common sense as well as clinical, and we now know empirically that that's the case. No one wakes up in the morning except for maybe a nihilist in a Dostoevsky novel and it's like, oh, life is totally meaningless. Let's celebrate. And the second book that Becker wrote after The Birth and Death of Meaning was about depression, where he argued that regardless of the biochemical or neuroanatomical underpinnings of depression, that it always comes down to an inability or an unwillingness to perceive life as meaningful. All right, but then Becker goes on and he says meaning is necessary, but not sufficient. That in addition to perceiving that life is meaningful, we also need to perceive that we meet or exceed the standards of value that are associated with the social role that we inhabit in the context of our culture. So if you're a nurse, your job's to save lives. If you're a warrior, your job is to kill people. If you're a banker, your job is to make money. And the Becker argument that we have adopted in our work, which is basically just 40 years of empirical research. We're egghead experimental social psychologists. And so we felt that Becker's ideas were quite compelling when he said that self-esteem is believing that life has meaning and you have value. And then he said that the primary function of self-esteem is to minimize anxiety. So what we did thereafter was to just conduct egghead research to test that particular hypothesis. So this was one of the first studies that we did where we showed if you momentarily elevate people's self-esteem and then threaten them, sometimes quite literally, like in one study, we raised people's self-esteem momentarily. We told them they were about to receive painful electrical shocks, and we measured physiological arousal. And sure enough, momentarily elevated or dispositionally high self-esteem reduced both self-reported anxiety as well as physiological arousal. And that particular study has been replicated in a variety of ways, more than a dozen times. And so it's on both empirical as well as theoretical grounds that we argue that Becker is on the right track when he describes self-esteem as an anxiety buffer. Now, this is not to suggest, however, that that is the only way to procure psychological equanimity, but from Becker's perspective, it's a central one.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting into more depth into your empirical work that the three of you and other collaborators have performed. But I'd still like to dig a bit more into the foundations with Becker before we get into that. And one, just to maybe give us a contemporary secular context in which to frame this idea that self-esteem is the perception that one is a person of value in a world of meaning. Maybe today, where people value others for their beauty, their wealth, their intellectual accomplishments, their fame, then to believe that one has self-esteem on this view is to believe that these things are meaningful and that one scores highly in these sorts of categories. Is that roughly on the right track?
Yeah, no, Robinson, that is actually, you nailed it. And, while we're on this point, I don't want to go too far afield, but that also helps us understand why we are right now suffering from, literally a pandemic of psychological dis-ease. In other words, right now, America is a petri dish of psychopathology. Depression is many times higher than it ever was. A third of the people in America are addicted to drugs and alcohol. The other third are spraying cheese whiz on a cracker while they down a 12-pack of beer before they jump in their car to drive a couple of miles, to get to Walmart to buy a machine gun and a lemon. In other words, there's no, I think there's no disagreement that we're in a pervasive state right now of psychological dis-ease, and that's independent of the pandemic. And you're a philosophy guy. Do you know Michael Sandel at Harvard wrote a book called The Tyranny of Merit?
Yes.
And I like that book a lot for a variety of reasons, but Becker made the same point in the 1970s, which is that whenever you see wholesale misery in a society, you should take a look at what that culture values to assess whether or not those standards are attainable for the average individual. So Sandel's point, and he would say the same thing that you did, Robinson. We want to be rich. We want to be famous. We want to be Olympic athletes and world-class musicians. And we live in a society that Sandel puts it, we live in what we describe as a meritocracy, where every one of us supposedly starts in the same place, and we all therefore get to strive for excellence. The problem, he points out, is that we only value people in our world as if they're the absolute best at what they do. So it doesn't matter if you have a lot of money, Elon Musk has more. It doesn't matter if you're pretty. The woman on the cover of Cosmopolitan, who doesn't look like that because she's 20% tinier, they photoshopped her. But my point is, if you want a silver medal in the Olympics, you're still a loser. And Sandel's point is that we have created a recipe for psychological despair by living in a culture where N-1 people in every social category are failures. And as Sandel puts it, it shouldn't surprise us that half of America is depressed and the other half is enraged. And but back to the point, the self-esteem is garnered by embracing generally dominant cultural values and then striving to attain or exceed them.